I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. And thank you all for joining us for Business Over Breakfast. This turns out to be month 14 of the Business Over Breakfast webinars, which kicked off back in April 2020 with Professor Tom Smith, helping us sort out what effect the pandemic was having on the economy for ourselves personally and on our organizations. Our goal was to help us all move from survive to thrive. Now our goal is to help you make more informed moves that set you, your teams, businesses, and communities up for a successful future. But first, I'd just like to send our thoughts to those with friends, families, and colleagues in India. The news is distressing enough for those just consuming the media, but must be devastating to those with close ties to the country and those in the country. So our thoughts are with you. It is my pleasure, though, to reintroduce Professor Tom Smith, a champion, or our champion of these Business Over Breakfast webinars, and an expert in labor economics, pricing, sports economics, and financing, and the economics of the entertainment industry and healthcare. Back with him today is special guest, Dr. Bill McKinnon, who among his many degrees is the Goizueta MBA alum. And Bill's career has focused on technology, telecommunications, and entrepreneurial ventures. Tom and Bill are going to kick off the webinar with their observations about what is happening in the economy and translating that into what that means for us, followed or interspersed with a Q&A. So please write your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to get as many of those answered today by Bill and Tom. At the end of today's session, we will post a recording of the webinar on our Emory Executive Education LinkedIn page, so please follow that. And we'd love your feedback. So please fill out the survey at the end of today's session. We do pay attention to them, and they help us set up these webinars and make them relevant for you. So enjoy the morning with Tom and Bill, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in 2 weeks' time. Over to you, Tom and Bill.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Appreciate that introduction. Tom and I have got a few things we put together to discuss to at least kick things off for the next, hopefully 30 minutes or so. And we're leaving plenty of time, hopefully available for questions. Let me see if I can share my screen real quick. There we go. So as I mentioned, there are a bunch of things going on these days. It's nothing like having an economy in flux, particularly due to a pandemic. And as Nicola mentioned, the events, the crisis really that's been going on in India has definitely been one of the key factors we've been thinking about over the last several weeks while we've been preparing and what its influence is going to be here in the States. But on a positive note, we are also watching what the progress has been on getting the citizenry here in the U.S. Let's see. Is that better?
Yep.
Yes. All right, getting the citizenry here in the U.S. Inoculated against COVID, and we're particularly hopeful about the possibility of being able to get teenagers approved, since they've been one of the biggest concerns that we've had regarding remaining a pool for the virus, which still can be transmitted around through our schools, and as a result to a number of a fairly high percentage of the population that still has yet to get both of the inoculations that at least two of the treatments are requiring. As I think we discussed the last time that we were together, President Biden was able to get his initial stimulus package through Congress and passed, and able to get money into the hands of people who have desperately needed it. He's now been pushing for a $2 trillion infrastructure bill that's currently in negotiation. We're going to talk a little bit about that, a little bit about jobs. It seems like, though, the word of the week is inflation, and the concern about prices that seem to be rising pretty much across the board. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about where things stand in terms of the number of COVID cases here in the States. This chart is showing the number of cases that have been reported here in the US on a daily, weekly, and biweekly basis in blue, red, and green. We can see that the number of new cases is definitely tapering off as a result of the immunizations that have happened here in the States. However, of course, the key thing is until we're able to get control of our population's inoculation, we really aren't going to have complete control over what's going on in the economy. In terms of initial unemployment claims, we see that they're dropping, at least from the amazing levels that they hit back in the last spring and summer. I think I even saw just this morning a report that claims from last week hit 525,000 new initial claims, which is a far cry from where it has been, and definitely is showing signs of improvement. But as well here, looking at the unemployment rate, the latest numbers we've gotten have it in the neighborhood of 6%. But the key thing that we're really focusing on here in this slide is the line in red, which is the number of people employed. And we aren't seeing a lot of movement here since September. I think since September, we've seen less than 1 million new jobs that have been taken. And with a little bit of thought, it's pretty apparent that, especially given our previous conversations about the K recovery, that a number of people have ended up essentially abandoning plans for employment in order to stay home and be caregivers for children that are in school. And the concern is that we aren't going to be able to see any sort of change in these numbers until school lets out, probably in the next 30 days or so. And then it'll take another 30 days in order to get those numbers so that we can actually see what the effects have been of that issue. So the second thing that Nicola mentioned earlier has been the ongoing tragedy that's been going on in India. And considering everything that's going on in the Far East right now, while China has been able to pull out of the COVID crisis after almost 18 months, India is falling into an amazingly disastrous condition. And the issue with that is really sort of the same issue that we saw here at home, which is essentially the impact on labor. Labor shortages here have resulted in a little bit of a herky-jerky start or restart to the economy that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And it's really still becoming the big place where we're stubbing our toe in terms of getting people back to work, getting supplies back into the marketplace, and making the economy run again. Well, you take that sort of thing and drop it in place into India, where the most important thing is going to be people's health, not necessarily where they're going to be working, spending their days. The impact to global distribution and production is going to be phenomenally bad, and result in either increased prices, either from goods that are still being imported either from or through that part of the world, or it's going to mean us domestically trying to find alternatives in our supply chain, assuming that that's possible. And the increased prices is what we're currently seeing, and what a lot of folks are pointing to and saying is inflation. So just like China and the US were held at a standstill last year, India and South America are probably going to be the biggest problems that we're going to have over the next 12 months. Tom, do you have anything you'd want to add to that?
Well, there was a couple questions here that would probably be relating to some earlier slides that I wouldn't mind answering now, since we're sort of in this unemployment labor element. One of the questions had to do with the unemployment and if there was any bounce back in the nonprofit sector. as you know, whenever we're into an economic recession, usually we see a huge decline in the number of contributions, gifts, and grants to nonprofits. And again, all the evidence points to the fact that that's going to be the case again here. And these sectors then have a very, very difficult time, keeping staff, trying to figure out a way to, get things done without the money coming in. And so I would suspect that we'll see the same kind of patterns when the economy gets going again. These nonprofits will be able to get a cash flow and hire back some of these employees. But until that happens, these nonprofits are going to continue to run very lean. In the healthcare sector, we have seen hospitals getting back. Well, at least we thought they were going to get back to a normal with respect to elective surgeries. And we've seen that in some hospitals and some units. Not all the units are running functionally the way that they were 16 months ago, but all the evidence I've seen is that they're getting back to that point. So that's a good question. We had a question about whether or not there was the economic stimulus was discouraging workers, and I would add to that, whether or not the additional $300 unemployment insurance was discouraging workers. Now we've had that claim, and I'm sure that you can find some anecdotal evidence. Here's an example, if you will. But there's been no, let's say, hard evidence of significant relationship between either the stimulus or the other. This is only one of maybe 3 different stimulus packages that have been passed now, maybe 4 actually, and unemployment, or there has been no evidence that the additional unemployment insurance, that it was initially $600, then it went to $300, that was discouraging workers. But mostly you're looking at different states that have certain different amount of that unemployment insurance sort of boost, and there's just no statistical evidence that the states that have that lower amount, or the ones that have dropped that amount, people have just flocked back to work. I think they're still being handcuffed to the house because their kids are still, by and large, being schooled at the house, and you need somebody to make sure the third graders learning history or what have you. Unfortunately, that really falls into to women. I mean, most of the household production in that area is taken on by women. And so we are seeing this huge discrepancy between the male labor force participation rate and the female labor force participation rate. And so I think we're going to continue to see those differences until schools open back up. We get the vax for kids 11 to 15. I saw that Pfizer was actually going to go for a little bit younger group as well. We get that group fully vaccinated. Schools open up next fall. I think we're going to see a huge change in labor force participation rates of women at that time.
Yeah, and hopefully even in the summer, we'll be able to see seasonal workers getting back into the employment pool, as well as professional women getting back into the office place, such as the office place is going to be. And we're going to talk a little bit about real estate as well, somewhere along the way in the presentation.
Bill, do we have a slide about inflation? Can you pull up a slide about inflation? Because we've had a question about inflation and deflation.
We do. Let's see. Does that work?
I'm not seeing your screen. So if you could share your screen, that would be perfect.
Oh, details. Try that.
Yeah. So, and do we have a screen of the year-over-year change in this TPI?
Yeah, we do.
Right. So let me address this question here. So yes, we were worried about deflationary trends. Usually when you have a supply side shock, which we did in 1974, Yom Kippur Wars and OPEC oil embargo in 1979, again with the fall of Shah of Iran, and again another OPEC oil embargo, you get this huge cost push inflation and things get out of control. When you have a demand side shock like we had in 2001, in 2008. And I would argue that this is a demand side shock recession that we are experiencing now. You can get more deflationary pressures. And so, we've been asked about that. So last year there were some issues about deflationary pressures, and we saw that in some areas. And of course, now inflation and deflation are capturing price levels over a large swath of businesses, not just in any one area. So we may have seen a decrease in the prices of some household goods, but then increase in prices of other goods. But yeah, I was concerned about a deflation now, but we're actually seeing a little bit of inflation. Okay. And so inflation is usually primarily a monetary phenomena. So it's like the Fed kicks things into gear and you get all this money. And once this money hits the economy, people start spending it, and this can create inflationary tendencies. We're seeing inflation in a variety of areas. Bill, like what? Like housing, right?
Housing and lumber is a big one these days. Copper, raw materials, glass, and it's even trickling into food. Is turning into a sector that's seeing. And this is something, Tom, you and I have talked about offline. Is it truly inflation, or is it just price spikes that are in a broad swath of categories? And have we achieved the breadth in order to say, yes, there are inflationary forces at work here?
Yeah. So there was a release from the BLS that mentioned that sort of annualized inflation for the last month may be at about 2.6%. And Warren Buffett, Oracle of Omaha, said just right out, yeah, now we've got inflation. Everybody is sort of taking the gloves off, and they're comfortable raising prices. And we saw this just this last week. I think it was General Mills, Procter and Gamble, these companies that are producing, let's say, forward-facing consumer products, the toilet papers and the cereals and things like this. They, I believe, were handcuffed a little bit last year. They probably saw huge spikes in demand. They had disruptions to their supply chains, but they probably, arguably correctly, identified that if they started increasing prices, people would accuse them of price gouging in the middle of a recession and in the middle of a pandemic. And probably they would have, people would have gone after them. Department of Justice, right? And most states have anti-gouging laws. So I don't think that they increased prices as much as they wanted to, or as much as they could have, or maybe as much as they should have, given what their production costs were. But I'm pretty sure that the gloves are off now, and they're like, okay, fine, we got to increase prices by 20%, 15%, 25% in order to catch up from last year. And so that's going to start impacting us on a daily basis. I don't think it's that problematic, though. Bill and I have talked about this. Bill, I mean, do you think, I don't know, do you think this inflation is unreasonable? Let's say 2%, 2.5% inflation. I would guess maybe 2.5% inflation, maybe going up to 3% inflation.
Well, it depends on how you look at it. If, looking at the slide that we've got here, you can see how inflation has tracked over the last few years. It's been fairly moderate, and we've had times have been fairly flush up until the time of the pandemic. And like you say, Tom, a number of companies probably felt like their hands were tied in terms of implementing significant price changes over the past year. And so they're playing a little bit of catch up since they've had to dip into their coffers in order to supplement their prices. They haven't been able to raise them to where they would have liked to have. They've had that occur. As you mentioned, they've got supply chain issues. Right now, though, they've had those issues compounded by scarcity of labor and raw materials due to people being out of work because they've either been sick, home taking care of family, what have you. It's been difficult to keep business moving at expected levels. Now, admittedly, when you're on the other end of the stick and you've been sitting at home twiddling your thumbs for the past year, and you go, hey, you know, I really have got to finish out this basement because I'm going to be working from home for a while. I got to go out and buy umpty-ump cubic length of lumber, and suddenly you think that job that was going to cost you $5,000 is suddenly going to cost you closer to $20,000, which is roughly what lumber has skyrocketed to. Or if you're a home builder and you usually are going to use $10,000 to $15,000 worth of wood, and now suddenly the price that you're going to need to pay for the house or charge for the house has increased by $50,000. Yeah, that's going to sting if you don't have the $50,000 to put into it to begin with. But unfortunately, that's the way things are working right now. Same with consumer goods. And like I mentioned, raw materials, copper in particular has also seen dramatic impact, as has every other industry in the supply chain that relies on copper, on fuel, on, like I say, wood, everything else.
Yeah, one of the questions we just had was, what's going on with this particular graph and what we're using. So we're using the CPI. We decided to use CPI because there was the report that came out that Warren Buffett commented on was based on a CPI calculation. You can use the GDP deflator, you can use producer purchasing index, you can use a number or a combination of these things. What we recognize is, of course, the CPI is not perfect. None of these indicators are, but it does give you a good idea about what's going on with respect to inflationary trends. This graph in particular uses a model where we set the time horizon looking backwards to estimate what's going forward. And the blue line, which shows, let's say, the most sort of moderated and is let's say a 12-month backward horizon, and then the 24 and 36, the red and the green, are saying, like, let's suppose you look a little bit further backwards. Can you use that information to predict what's going forward? I would argue that probably the 24-month estimate here is the most likely, given what the Fed is saying their policy response is. Remember, last fall, Jerome Powell mentioned that the Fed was no longer going to target the Taylor rule in a very strict fashion. The Fed engages in contractionary, or is supposed to engage in contractionary monetary policy if or when the inflation rate starts ticking above 2%. But the Fed said, look, we've experienced considerably long periods of time where we've had inflation that's under 2%. If we actually encourage people to spend and inflation rises above 2% for a small period of time, this isn't going to trigger an automatic contractionary monetary response. So what they're saying is the Fed is not going to push up rates by 50 basis points or 100 basis points just because we're hitting like 2.5% or 3% inflation. What this means, and I appreciate the question earlier about deflationary trends, is that when you are experiencing a deflationary trend in the economy, people tend to hoard money and they don't actually go out and spend, which actually is terrible for an economic recession. During an inflationary trend, especially if the inflation is, let's say, contained between, let's say, 2 to 3%, it may actually light a fire underneath people where they go out and spend money, which wouldn't be a bad thing. If you actually want to try to encourage people to spend their stimulus money. So if people say like, "Oh, I think you know what? As Bill mentioned, I've been sitting on this basement remodel. Yeah, let's go out and do it. Like I don't want to get caught flat-footed here. Let's go out and spend the money." Boom, that's exactly what you need from a fiscal stimulus to actually get this money churning. That's what moves the economy forward.
So maybe just to put a cap on this, Tom, we got a question about how long are these, the question was actually about lumber, although I would broaden it to say, how long are these inflationary forces going to take in order to dissipate? If we wait for a year for home building projects, will lumber rates go back down? Well, Lumber rates will probably go back down unless inflation just continues to get them to a new status quo expected level. However, from what we've seen, and we can talk about it a little more depending on if we've got time, what we're seeing is that more than likely in the home building sector, the real estate industry, at least residential real estate, is going to remain hot through the rest of the year, at least, and possibly even into 2022. Would not be surprising at all. Do we want to go back and talk a little bit more about inflation and the recovery here domestically? You see any other questions, Tom?
Well, one of the question was sort of, what do you, it's like, what do you call the phenomenon where you can't find a job, you can't feed your family, you can't pay your rent? Actually, I mean, we have some charts at the end that are talking about rental distress, food distress. So there was a court case yesterday. A judge identified that the government cannot put a moratorium on evictions en masse. So the court said, nope, you can't do it. You can't tell individual landlords that they can't start evicting people. This is very problematic. And I was thinking about this yesterday. And this is, I don't know if it's, I think it was William who had asked this question. So I would gather that there's 100 people who are listening to this. Probably 90 to 95% of the people who are listening to this were very inconvenienced with this recession, right? So your life was modified, your life turned sideways. And of course, people will say, this is what happened to my family. And I'm sure that there are very tragic events. Most of us, let's say, professionals. So if you're listening to this, you're likely a professional. You probably were inconvenienced, but you probably aren't in danger of losing your house. And you probably, the recession is hitting different groups substantially different, which I think is very problematic. So there is probably not enough emphasis, William, on the fact that the recession has been incredibly impactful for, let's say, middle income down. And these people are in fear of losing their house, fear of feeding their family. So there's food distress, there's housing distress, and there's no, let's say, national moratorium that we can put on these things and or create, let's say, these national food banks. Like everything is done regionally or locally. What I call it is this K-shaped recovery. And I am fearful that we're going to see this recession persist for groups. So everybody who is in the lower income, let's say lowest quartile of income, maybe the lowest two quartiles of income, are bearing the brunt of this recession and will continue to bear the brunt of the recession for another year or longer. So, and I think that Jerome Powell actually mentioned something about this the other day. Like the people who are least capable of weathering this storm are the ones who are weathering the storm the most. Like they are front facing. It is really a terrible situation. There's not a lot of anything you can do other than additional fiscal stimulus that is aimed at this population and or trying to, let's say, get people who have multi-residential housing, get them taken care of so that they can continue to pass on, let's say, some of those safety nets to their renters. So it's really problematic. We've never seen a recession like this where it has hit a particular group so much harder than it's hit other groups. And so it's a real challenge. So I hope I answered your question. What you call it is it's a K-shaped recovery, and it's terrible. I mean, like there's, in 2001, you recall that we had this jobless recovery where unemployment rate hung at about 5% forever, and just people were just so annoyed. It's so hard to get back after you have this demand side shock. Like people were like, what do we do now? The world's falling apart. It's hard to get people moving again. It's hard to get businesses to hire again, particularly. So Let me see what else. What else do we have here? Ruling of CDC couldn't impose a national eviction moratorium, right? It could be legislated at a federal level. Are the questions about what could be done at the state or local level? Yeah, things have to be done at the state level. And this is what we saw actually as well, is that even end of the fall last year, Texas had started to evict people. And there were hundreds of court cases a day where they were like saying, you're evicted, you're evicted, you're evicted, you're evicted. Reading the stories from the sheriffs who had to show up in people's houses and kick them out is just heart-wrenching. And so, anyway, Michael, we're in a recession until we're not. That is, we don't get to call that the balls and strikes. We can armchair quarterback that, but the business dating cycle committee, they're the ones that get to call balls and strikes. And one of the things about the 6.4% rate is that in the middle of the Great Depression, GDP was rising at, over 10%. But when you've fallen so far down, you can have very, very large increases, but you're still not back to where you were before. That's one of the interesting things, mathematically interesting things about when you lose a lot. So if you get a 10% decrease in you get $100 and I take 10% away from you, you're at $90. And now if I give you 10% back, right, you're only at 99. I mean, you have to grow more than you lost in order to recover everything that you've lost. And so we're going to be in a recession for a while. I do not think we're out of the recession. All right. Are there other questions or other elements here? Bill, I sort of got a little sidetracked, sort of answering some questions on the fly.
Flipping through. This seems like a good time. So we can talk a little bit about the recovery and talking about jobs. The long and the short, just to get to your point, Tom, is that it's going to take a very long time to get our employment back to the point that it was 24 months ago. We're still in the 5 to 8 million people fewer working right now than we were then. And estimates right now are that it could be anywhere from latter half of 2024 to somewhere in 2026 before we get the same number of people working that we had then. I think we've pretty well covered a lot of these issues. Fuel and energy is another one of those sectors that's driven by a lot of the other raw materials that are being impacted. And so I at least have some concerns about how things are going to go in terms of gas prices this summer, but more importantly, how fuel and energy prices are going to be when winter comes, depending on how rough of a winter it is in places like New England, Chicago. Hopefully we won't have another freak snowstorm in Texas next year, but if you actually are still reading about that, the residual impact of that phenomena is absolutely mind-boggling. How the ripple effect of energy prices just due to that 1 week is still being dealt with all the way through the Great Plains.
Yeah, for sure. So people are asking about, the length of some of these price increases, for lumber. I think what you're seeing is people made choices. And this is one of the reasons why I'm also personally not too concerned about 2.5%, 3%, let's say inflationary trends right now, is because this recession and the pandemic have caused most of us to, let's say, refocus our household budget. So you may be doing considerably less dry cleaning, right? You're considerably less driving. Okay, so you got less fuel expenses. You probably were able to call Geico or somewhere else and get a little bit of a bump decrease on your insurance rates because you're not driving as much, right? You're probably not dry cleaning your clothes, but maybe you said, okay, but now I've got to make some improvements in my house. I got to upgrade my internet. I got to maybe build a new fence. Build out the basement, put in a new, whatever, make my house more livable or workable. So I think that people are just changing where they're spending their money, and so the inflation in, let's say, lumber, is it maybe not changing their overall lifestyle, or is putting too much of a burden on them, let's say, as just one particular asset. But as long as there is um, let's say necessity to reinvent your house into your office, then people are going to be hiring contractors. People are going to be reframing their basements, and it's putting an exceptional demand, right? Demand push on these commodities. Bill mentioned earlier copper prices as well. So new home wiring up your house, I mean, that puts a huge demand pressure on copper, which will increase those prices. And so, as long as that persists, then you're going to see some inflationary trends in those sectors. I think the real estate prices, though, and I'm going to ask Bill, I think real estate prices this summer are actually going to moderate a little bit. What are your thoughts on real estate?
I don't know. We're talking about residential real estate. I think they're gonna remain pretty high, particularly stable with where they are right now, and maybe even continue to increase a little bit before they peak out in the fall. Because I think the summer is the big prime buying time. I think your sellers are going to continue to push for every dollar they can get out of their homes. I think builders are going to be trying to throw up as much as they can for new home construction. Come fall, late into the fall after school starts, I think you're right. We may see some moderation then. Maybe we're splitting hairs here, but at this point, it's a coin flip in my mind.
One of
And
the
it's going to be
one,
dependent on the market as well.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there. There was a question about other sectors that if people are thinking about switching jobs, and or let's suppose that you were working in retail, or you were working at a restaurant or a bar or something like this, and now you need to switch jobs, and or you're just thinking about a general career change. You left your job, you helped your kid, learn Spanish in your living room, and now you're saying, okay, I'm going to jump back in. Might be a good time for me to think about a new profession. I think that every time there is a recession, every time there is some kind of a seismic shift in the market, there are new opportunities that pop up and old opportunities that go away. So the way that I look at it is asking, are there businesses that are satiating the needs of consumers now? So, I mean, it might be a good time to jump in and get a real estate license, right? Sort of say, okay, if I have a good understanding about what my neighborhood looks like or the neighborhoods around me, I have a good understanding about what families need, I could become a successful real estate agent in this period. That might be a good thing to think about. I've had some former students open up what are called ghost kitchens. Ghost kitchens is where you have a restaurant that doesn't really have a seating area. It just shows up on uh, Grubhub or Uber Eats or DoorDash or what have you. So they said, look, it's people are tired of the same old, same old. I could invent like a new wing place or a new burger place or a new type of pizza. Now we saw the businesses that were already in that situation did exactly that. And so I probably read, dozens of articles where people were like, I think I just ordered Chuck E. Cheese pizza from Chuck E. Cheese. I had no idea it was Chuck E. Cheese pizza because they opened up a kitchen in the back. And so businesses that were ready and able to do that did it because they saw an opening in the market. So if you're an entrepreneur, I recommend thinking about, opening up something like a ghost kitchen, or perhaps trying to figure out a way to satiate the need for new and interesting meal ideas at home. Of course, I mean, Bill and I were talking about this the other week about how the personal fitness industry is going gangbusters. but I might not become, let's say, I might be less inclined to become like a Peloton salesperson at this point. So it's like it, even within those industries, there are certainly better things and worse things that you can sort of jump into.
Sorry about that, Tom. I got kicked off my internet. Give me just a
Oh,
second to bring it back up.
okay. All right. There was a question about nonprofits, and also about arts and entertainment. Yeah, so New York is opening back up. I think that Broadway is going live. Don't quote me on this, next week or the week after. And I think that Hamilton is going to be one of the first shows that's saying, yeah, we're going to like fully embrace this going back online. And I know that there's concerts in town. And so, I just bought some tickets for my kids to go see Def Leppard. I think they're going to be at Truist Fields sometime later this summer. I should know when because I just bought them tickets. But, my kids were like, hey, we haven't done anything for a year and a half. Let's go see Def Leppard. Like, wait, and Poison. That's a great idea. Sounds like fun. Okay. So, and Truist is opening up 100% capacity May 7th. And so I think that entertainment is like coming back. I wouldn't bet on all of entertainment coming back. I don't think movie theaters are going to come back the same way that they were before. I hope that, let's say, New York theater can come back robustly. I love the theater, but there's no guarantees that people are going to just start spending money the way that they were as soon as these things open up. I don't know what industries, Bill, what industries do you think are like on the verge of like taking off again and, becoming more robust?
Um, well, I've actually been reading a little bit about, there are a couple of brands that took a beating. Brooks Brothers went into bankruptcy last year. I think professional clothing and attire is going to come back in conjunction with real estate. Travel is a big one. Disney is no longer checking temperature. I think I read they're at 50% occupancy, and Disneyland just opened in California. So that's going to be a huge boon to their balance sheet. But that with air travel and rental cars will come petroleum and energy. So that's kind of where my crystal ball is leading me. We also had a question about the impact of the recession on interest rates, and I definitely wanted to get a little bit into that. Have I got the inflation slide up now correctly?
I haven't seen that, but
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So the main thing is that there is a tie between inflation, interest rates, the Federal Open Market Committee. If investors, I've got here on the slide in front of me, if the investment community thinks that Fed rates, overnight lending rates, are too low, and then they will be expecting that inflation will grow over the ensuing months or years. And as such, that's going to be pushing the yield curve steeper, so that longer term investments they want longer term investments to be pricing in the risk of inflation, because they don't want to get caught with their pants down. An investor, that is, doesn't want to get caught with their pants down with inflation growing while they're sitting on a bond waiting for it to mature. So they want, ideally, in order to invest in a long-term maturity instrument, they're going to want for that instrument to have the risk of inflation going up and eroding their returns priced into the bond. So that's a little bit about the tie between inflation, bond prices, and what's going on with the Fed. And one of the things that we had put together for today was what's called a dot plot. And Tom, you put this one together. You want to talk a little bit about this?
Well, the Fed, the Board of Governors, they asked the Board of Governors what they think is going to be the most appropriate federal funds target rate in 6 months, a year, 2 years, what have you. And given, then they query each of the governors, and right now you see them there. It's all of these like orange dots here, all at like between 0 and 0.25%, which is essentially free money. Everybody right now in the Fed, the Board of Governors says, yeah, we're at the appropriate rate. As you go forward, there's still, for the next 2 years, a considerable number of the governors who are saying we got to keep rates at or near 0. But as you go into 2024, you've got people who are saying, okay, we think that the long-term federal funds rate is maybe about 2.5%, somewhere between 2.5 and 2.25% is what everybody thinks is gonna happen. So that we're seeing sort of this long-run trend that the Fed will engage in what's called contractionary monetary policy, where they're raising their federal funds rate target. Right now, this of course will have all the other rates will sort of mirror that rate as well. They're not caused by the federal funds target rate, but they do mirror it. And so interest rates on your car or your mortgage rates or what have you are also going to go up. But right now the Fed is seeing that they are not going to increase target rates. They're not going to engage in contractionary policy. If we believe, sort of the macro models that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, then what will happen is that we will see some inflationary tendencies over the next, let's say, 2 years. I'm hoping that this can be moderate inflation rather than anything else. I would also gather that if we saw something above 3% inflation kind of grip our economy, that the Fed would probably increase interest rates by 50 basis points, 75 basis points, try to like sort of kick that inflation out as quickly as they can. There was somebody who did ask another question, Bill, about like how long real estate prices might be going up, and if there was sort of any way around that. Are they going to build more houses? Is there going to be a supply side response to the increase in price, real estate prices? What are your thoughts?
So this is one of the half dozen or so topics specifically that we've been tracking. So, leading in, that was actually a good lead in from the overnight lending rates. As Tom mentioned, those overnight lending rates are essentially the basis for your bond rates, your mortgage lending rates in banks. And so the more that those overnight rates are kept at 25 basis points, the lower mortgage rates are going to be kept. And we've talked previously about, mortgage rates are low, but banks are being extremely picky about who qualifies for their mortgages. However, assuming you can qualify, it's a huge time, and apparently it's a huge time for a lot of people to play in the real estate space. And that's both in new construction as well as in remodeling the house. Like we said, you've been sitting at home for a year. You've got to make your house more office ready, more homeschool ready, what have you. And so you're sitting around twiddling your thumbs, looking out your backyard window and going, I got to replace that fence. I got to take on all these home improvement projects, and this is the time to do it. And that's what's driving prices. That demand is what's driving prices for the limited supply of home construction goods up. In terms of which areas of the country are doing well, from what National Association of Realtors is saying, the Southeast and the Midwest are great places to try to sell your home to make a profit. They're also affordable places to go and live. There are a number. I'm sure that folks have read the articles about the trend of everyone in Silicon Valley is abandoning San Francisco, and it's going to be a ghost town next year. Well, okay, maybe that's an exaggeration, but there's a push for folks to move out of places where it's extremely expensive to live, whether that's New York or San Francisco or what have you, and move into more affordable locations. Home prices, though, are still rising, and the projections are that it's going to continue to rise. And looking across the country, if your average home price has increased by 15% last year, it's projected to increase 6% this year and 4% next. The trend is nobody's got any idea of how long this is going to continue. If you look at lumber and lumber futures as a precursor or as a proxy or an indicator for real estate prices, lumber futures indicate that this trend is going to continue at least through this calendar year. So take that as you will. Now, hey, Tom, one other thing we've got here on this slide is talking a little bit about commercial real estate. And I know that you've got a couple of buddies in that space. Is there anything you'd want to add to these couple of points? Basically, we were pointing out that, yeah, companies are responding to COVID and they're cutting their office space leases. Of course, in the extremely dense office areas like Atlanta, that's hitting those areas hard. And malls and retail space, they're turning into all sorts of other creative projects that developers can come up with. Anything from data centers, distribution centers, healthcare facilities, and even near and dear to you, sports arenas.
Yeah, that's right. You're turning your old Sears into an Amazon fulfillment center.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, during recessions, people become incredibly entrepreneurial if they see an opening, especially if they have access to capital. I do think that the real estate has been an incredibly mixed bag. I've talked to a number of my former students who work in this area, who are real estate developers, or help, you know, offices with respect to, let's say, different kind of mixed use, some residential, commercial, what have you. There is no one consistent impact of this on real estate other than it is a real mixed bag. That is to say that the people I've talked to said, you know, the credit tenants initially were real janky. They decided that they weren't going to pay. They wanted to renegotiate their rents and saying, look, the only reason that people are coming to this strip mall is because of me. So give me a better deal. Just about every real estate professional that I've talked to said that there has been lots of communication. Banks have been very open about working with developers or owners of property to try to make sure that they aren't being defaulted on, that they're trying to keep cash flows consistent. They've also been open communication with people who have been renting, whether it's residential or commercial. It's a really mixed bag. And the stories that I'm hearing are fascinating because, let's say, you know, you're sort of your blue collar or just above blue collar, you know, families who are in multifamily houses. They're the ones that are doing everything they can to keep up with mortgage, their rents. They're trying to, you know, keep their payments, but it's like, okay, above them, this group is sort of taking advantage of some moratoriums and trying to, you know, push off some of their payments. And then below them, this group can't pay. And so what people I've talked to said, wow, there's just like a really mixed bag with respect to this. Somebody had mentioned some transportation, and I think that also leads into what we've been hearing lately about this labor market shortage. You and I, Bill, talked about this yesterday with respect to a labor market shortage. So at least one of the states I heard yesterday, I don't know if it's Montana or Colorado, forgive me for not keying in on that state, said that they're dropping their $300 unemployment bump because they're fearful that there is an unemployment shortage, and they're trying to motivate people to get back to work. This other person who just asked a question in the chat said, look, transportation has been going gangbusters, but there's a shortage of labor for transportation, like long haul truckers and what have you. You know, how does the economy address those, or how does the economy address other types of labor shortages? What are your thoughts on that, Bill?
I think there are going to be a number of creative things put into place in order to get people to get out to work. Unfortunately, the key issue, at least today, again, is going to be childcare and healthcare of family members. But to your point, yeah, I had heard similar things. And like you say, we had talked about it even just last night, that it's going to be a big sticking point, not only financially for local governments, state governments, but also politically and socially, I suspect, for the rest of the year, because there's going to come a time where the socioeconomic groups are going to rub up against each other, and people are going to start, forgive me, but probably either confronting the issue face to face or one-on-one and saying, hey, why aren't you working when I'm working and pulling my share of the load? And unfortunately, I'm a little bit concerned about how the country's dynamics are going to take to that sort of thing. It'll be a little bit like the 99% protests that we had several years ago. I could see it being something, call it what you will, 35%, wherever that socioeconomic line is, that folks are going to say, hey, either we need to get to work, or maybe I don't want to work and I'm comfortable with the way things are. Unfortunately, folks who take that sort of attitude, I suspect they won't be happy for long, just because the world's full of change.
One of the things that I've noted this in many professions, is that the profession says we've got a shortage of, pick your workers, right? So we've got a shortage of teachers, we've got a shortage of nurses, we have a shortage of truck drivers. The companies that don't have a shortage are the ones that identify that they're paying a wage that is below what their market mandates they have to do. And so if they want to eliminate the shortage, they basically increase the wage until it encourages entry into those markets. What I have been reading, and we didn't even talk about it, just in our casual conversation, is that the last year and a half of teaching has put an incredible amount of pressure on teachers, and there is perhaps a seismic shift in teachers in terms of retiring and or deciding they don't want to do this anymore, going back to school, becoming geologists or something. I mean, I think a lot of teachers are like, especially primary, secondary school, are saying, okay, enough. Like, this has been nuts. And I've read this article maybe in 4 different places, written in slightly different ways. And I think that there is a concern, that is a real concern, that a year from now, people are going like, whoa, like we're out of we're running out of teachers. Like that was a really, really tough period of time. Are we going to need to train people, or are school districts going to have to finally like push up these wages to encourage new people to enter? I think you're always getting mismatches between how the market works and how we pretend it works using just simple supply and demand graphs. The markets aren't magic. So when you have some kind of a sticking point, like a wage that is preventing people from entering in, the way the market has to fix that is by increasing the wage. And so I think we're going to see a massive number of teachers who are retiring or getting out of retiring. There's going to be huge shortages of teachers this next fall. You're probably going to read several articles or hear it on MSNBC or Fox or whatever. And the way that they have to fix that is by making teaching much more attractive, by increasing the wages. Same thing. Yeah, Michael just mentioned this. Same thing that we see in healthcare as well. Nurses are like, I'm done with this. I'm tapping out, right? And I think that when these markets go in this direction, people will change professions. But we've seen this in the past when there was big housing booms, or right, then all of a sudden everybody wanted to become a real estate agent. Until then, nobody could make money being a real estate agent, and so you went back to being like an auto mechanic or a teacher or what have you. So we constantly see these shifts in the economy. Yeah, go
You're
ahead.
absolutely right, Tom. And teaching, nursing, healthcare, where there are non-quantitative costs to the employees, you're right. They're going to probably have a dramatic impact over the next, 12, 24 months. And it's going to be hard to recruit people, and it's going to take some creative solutions. To that point, oil tanker drivers, truck drivers, apparently there are unusual requirements. And with COVID coming along and the issues in coming in contact with people. That's one of the labor issues that's affecting the oil and gas and energy sector. And they're having a hard time getting people trained and up to speed so that they can take the place of the previous generation. Unfortunately, it's tough to figure out what all of the non-quantitative hot buttons are that are going to affect folks.
Anything you want to close out on, Bill?
No, just that I appreciate y'all having me back. Obviously, this is an interesting time, and hopefully we're going to be able to find our way out of the weeds in the next several months. I know there are a lot of plans that lawmakers have in place, and so we'll see what comes out.
Yeah, let's ask the executive education group to bring us back in a couple months and see if some of our predictions hold true, and see what's happening with teachers, real estate prices, inflation, and bond rates.